The victorious powers at Waterloo sought the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty. The victorious powers included the British, the Austrians, and the Russians, and the Prussians. Those four monarchies fought and defeated Napoleon, and they then dictated to the French people what they would have as a new government, and they achieved what had been their goal all along through the Revolutionary Wars, which was the restoration of the Bourbons to the French throne. Now, the Bourbons traced their lineage back to Henry IV, 1589 to 1610. He had seized the throne in the War of the Three Henries against the Valois dynasty, and then for 200 years handed that crown down to his sons and his grandchildren. So Louis XIII, Louis XIV, Louis XV. Louis XVI is the one who got his head chopped off, right? He was accused of running away from France and joining the counter-revolutionary armies, the enemies of France. They put him on trial. The Republican government put him on trial and cut off his head for treason. They cut off his wife's head, Marie Antoinette, who was related to the monarchy in the Habsburg Empire. Their son, the Dauphin, according to hereditary rule, he outlived his father. We know that. And so he took the title and is attributed the title Louis XVII. But that young boy disappeared. There's lots of rumors and lots of stories about what could have happened. No one knows for sure. But it's quite clear he died, never to be seen. And so at the end of the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, the victorious powers, the British, the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians, placed Louis XVIII on the throne of France. This was not a selection by the French people. It was not a selection by the French army. This was based on the principle that he was the next in line for inheritance. This was his house. It was his personal property. It belonged to him. It was his right. Now, you can see on this chart that he had no children. And so we're going to see in a minute, when he dies, the throne goes to his brother, right? So Louis XVIII and Charles X are both the brothers of the decapitated king, Louis XVI. But I also want you to notice on this genealogy that there's another red name over here, Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe was the Duke of Orleans. So stretching back here. The Orleans traced their heritage back to Louis XIII. So Louis Philippe, as we're going to see in a minute, is related to the Bourbons, but this is a collateral branch, a secondary branch of the family. It's not immediately there. He's like a cousin. But as long as there is a better claim to the throne, he's off to the side, because the throne belongs to the direct descendant of Henry Bourbon, and that direct descendant living in 1815 was Louis XVIII, the 18th man named Louis to sit on the throne of France, and his family was a Bourbon. The victorious powers drafted and had him agree to a charter. So both the king and this charter, they didn't call it a constitution, that was too radical a term, but like a great charter, like a Magna Carta, a laying out of basic principles of government, a constitution, but you can't call it that because that's a radical word. So they called it a charter. What did this look like? So first and foremost, all authority in France resides in the person of the king. Whoa. That's a pretty bold statement. All authority in France resides in the person of the king. The rest of the charter, though, goes on to list ways that's not true and creates an incredible amount of ambiguity, room for interpretation. And anytime you have ambiguity and room for interpretation, this leads to clashes over implementation. So, for example, Frenchmen are equal before the law. This is a revolutionary concept. This was an idea stated by the French revolutionaries. Louis knew he could not go back. The British and the Austrians and the Prussians knew that this revolutionary idea was there to stay, and so they weren't going to try to reinstate the privileges that came with aristocratic rule. They also recognized that freedom of worship existed within France, the kingdom of France, but then said Catholicism is a religion of the state. So they tried to weave or thread a needle in which they could say, well, everybody's free to worship, but one religion is special over the others, and it was the established religion. That the government and the Catholic Church would work together to promote their mutual interest, but they would not require all Frenchmen to believe that. That's it's considered a compromise. It's the compromise that Napoleon had worked out in the Concordat with the papacy. But it does raise very serious questions about, okay, what does that religion of the state mean? Are priests state officials? Are bishops state officials? Can they make laws? Do the laws of the state correspond with the laws of religion? What if I disagree with the laws of religion? Do I not necessarily disagree with the state? Right? Opening up all kinds of questions of loyalty. To the king alone belongs all executive power. The king executed the laws. That's pretty straightforward. Not much different than the president of the United States. In the United States Constitution, the executive power rests with the president. But then the legislative power is exercised collectively by the king, the chamber of peers, the chamber of deputies of departments. So somehow the legislative power would be shared between the peers and the deputies. How is that supposed to work out? Did any one of them have sovereignty over the other? Where they, it suggests they're going to have to cooperate to write laws. Can the king issue laws by himself? Can the legislature issue laws by themselves? In the American Constitution, it's spelled out pretty well, right? Congress can pass laws by a majority of both houses. The president will either sign or veto those laws, but if they veto those laws, the House and the Senate can overrule the president and require the president to register the law whether he likes it or not, establishing Article 1 of the legislature as more important than the executive. Here, that's not as clear. So what was this chamber? Well, a deputy had to be age 40 and pay a direct tax of 1,000 francs. Right? So there was both an age qualification, a property qualification for sitting in this. Right? This was not a people body, right? Your blacksmith or Joe the turnip digger is not going to run for and sit as a deputy. This was supposed to be and intended to be an elite body. The electors were just as select, or almost as select, right? Instead of 40 years, you had to be 30 years old in order to vote and pay a direct tax of 300 francs. Not an easy thing to do in early 19th century France. So there were both age and property qualifications for voting and sitting in this Chamber of Deputies. In other words, they were trying to avoid democracy. They did not want to have universal manhood suffrage. They certainly didn't want to have universal suffrage with women voting. And so they introduced age and property qualifications to try to provide a stable electorate and a stable lower house. The upper house, the peers, right, what we would call the House or the Senate, and in the English call the House of Lords, the appointment of peers of France belongs to the king. The number is unlimited. He can, at his pleasure, alter their dignities, right? Either lift them up or put them down, appoint them for life, or make them hereditary. So if the king favors someone, he could appoint them as a peer, elevate them a peer, and then if he likes them really a lot, he can tell them, well, your children will inherit that position. And they're unlimited. So if the king doesn't like what's happening in the House of Peers, he can just create more who owe him a favor and keep him there. Or if he doesn't like them, he can alter their dignities, demote them, take them out. This is designed to give the king a heavy hand in legislation. All justice emanates from the king. In other words, judges answer to the king. Judges don't answer to the legislature. There's no legislative oversight over the judicial branch. The judicial branch, the legislative branch cannot remove judges, impeach judges. It's up to the king. So if judges do things that the king doesn't like, he can remove them. If they rule in his favor, he can promote them and keep them. So while this is a charter, there are appearances of separation of powers. It's quite clear that the implementation of this charter depends upon the will of the king, the will of the monarch. If the monarch were moderate, such as Louis XVIII, right? He watches his brother get his head chopped off. He watches hundreds of thousands of others get their heads chopped off. He realizes the turmoil that comes from when a king and the people don't get along. Right? So he moderates his own governing and he keeps his head. But not all French aristocrats agreed with that approach. Louis was more in line with moderate monarchists. Whether or not the law limited his behavior, he realized that there were limits based upon real or perceived grievances. And so he would do his best not to aggravate the people, because once people get aggravated, they'll chop your head off. Right? But the ultra monarchists, they were not willing to go along. They did not want restrictions placed on. They thought that the charter provided too many concessions to the people, and they wanted more restrictions placed on popular participation. They gained a talking point when a noble, a very popular noble, the Duke de Berry, fell to an assassin in 1820. That assassination triggered a backlash against popular participation. The monarchists, the ultra-monarchist rebels say, see, the popular violence continues. We need law and order. They called it regicide. Regicide continues. It's not safe to be an aristocrat in France anymore. That this radical idea of popular sovereignty had infected people, and that fever pitch was still there. And if you give it an inch, it's going to take a mile. When Louis XVIII died, the crown passed to his brother, Charles X, right? The 10th man named Charles to sit on the French throne. He was a Bourbon, right? Because the charter allowed for the crown to pass by hereditary purposes. It wasn't going to be elected. It still belonged to the Bourbons. And as king, Charles exercised his prerogatives. And one of the things he wanted to do was reward the immigrants that defended his family against the French people. So he demanded that French tax money be used to compensate property loss by immigrants. Right? These immigrants were French aristocrats. They had owned property, they had owned chateaus, they had owned land. And during the French Revolution, they fled France, scared they were going to be killed by revolutionaries. Many of these families joined counter-revolutionary armies. And said, Charles says they needed to be rewarded by me because they were loyal to me. They were loyal to France, right? Because France to him was not the people of France, but France to him was the kingdom that his family owned. He then introduces education reform. Napoleon had helped set up a secular education to teach people about reading and to teach boys about reading and teach boys about math and teach boys about science and engineering. What the conservatives were upset is that this education system lacked morality. It wasn't a moral education. By moral education, they meant a Catholic education. And so Charles reintroduced Catholicism to the curriculum of schools, right? So you can worship wherever you want, but your child must be taught the ideas, the theology, and the morality of Roman Catholicism. But you're free to believe whatever you want. But the state will promote this theology in its public schools. Is that consistent with the charter, or is that overstepping his bounds? The Roman Catholic Church had opposed the Republic, right? The Pope had actually called the Republic an abomination and said that anybody who participated in Republican politics could not be a Catholic in good standing. The Pope supported the counter-revolutionary armies. Charles said, no, the Pope and Roman Catholicism supports France because France is my house, right? France is my property. France isn't the people of France. France is mine. The people of France simply live in my house, and as long as you can live in my house, you're going to play by my rules. And my rule says you're going to at least listen to and hear about Roman Catholicism. He finally introduced a set of ordinances in July 1830. And these ordinances triggered popular violence. Those ordinances included restrictions of freedom of the press. The popular press expressed greater and greater hostility to Charles and the Roman Catholic Church, greater and greater hostility towards the idea of this restoration, right? Even though we're 15 years down the line, Charles, with his previous policies on immigrants and education reform, had triggered a backlash, not just against him, but against the idea of a monarchy. And so he said, well, in order to put a stop to this, we're going to stop the press, right? Stop the presses. Censorship. He reduced the number of deputies. He wasn't going to listen to him anyway, so why have all these people pretend that they're in an official position? Why give them an official platform to criticize him and his government? And he eliminated all legislative amendments. In other words, Charles was a divine right absolute monarch, and he was going to consolidate sovereignty into his own hands. He is going to restore what his grandfather and his great-grandfather had done to make France great. After chopping one king's head off and fighting revolutionary wars, there wasn't much tolerance for this type of monarchical overreach. The Parisians took to the streets, and once they did, Charles realized, well, I'm not sticking around for this. I know how this takes out. So Charles left, he fled. Now, I'm sure he's thinking at this moment that he's going to come back on a wave of glory, but the French really, these popular street movements had another revolution, and they weren't going to have any more of Charles. The question is, do they need a monarch? Was Charles the end of a monarchy, right? To be or not to be?